It's time for the Sony A6700. It shoots 4K 120 FPS super slow motion. It takes great photos. Ooh, look at that moon. And it's so compact, it almost fits in the pockets of your pants. Both American and British pants. You choose. Anyway, stick around, because what I will tell you in this review will probably help you decide whether to get this camera or not. The Sony A6700 was introduced on July 12, 2023 and is the successor to the very popular 2020 A6600. The camera competes with the Fujifilm XS20 and Sony's own ZV-E series, compact mirrorless cameras without viewfinders designed for vlogging. The A6700 is an APS-C mirrorless camera in rangefinder style. This means you don't get the viewfinder on top, but on the side, and the shape is more compact and less like a traditional DSLR. The backside illuminated APS-C sensor has 26 megapixels. Backside illuminated doesn't mean the light comes from the back, but it means light is captured and processed in a more efficient way, which will result in better overall image quality. At the time of recording, the body will cost you $1389 US, but in all honesty, I have never seen a camera with such fluctuating prices, going from $1699 to $1299 US. Compared to its predecessor, the A6700 has made significant improvements in many aspects, except for the battery life. Although it uses the same FZ100 battery, the A6700 can capture 470 shots instead of 810 according to SIPA. Furthermore, the megapixel count went up from 24 to 26, uses the new Bionz XR instead of X processor. It now has 759 AF points with AI technology. We can also find 5-axis internal stabilization, new 4K 60 and 4K 120 FPS film capabilities, and it's about 15 grams lighter than the A6600. And it has a faster maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th. That maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th is nothing if you compare to the 1/32,000th of the Fujifilm XS20. The XS20 can take up to 30 photos per second, where the A6700 can capture a maximum of just 11 photos per second. They both have 26 megapixel APS-C BSI sensors. The A6700 can reach a whopping 120 FPS in 4K, but the XS20 has a bigger resolution of 6.2K and both can capture 4K oversampled material. The XS20 can also record 6.2K raw film with an external recorder, where the A6700 can do such thing. They both have log modes, vari-angle screens and subject detection, but only the A6700 tracks its subjects and has a faster and more reliable autofocus. Price-wise, the XS20 wins, but does that mean it's also a better camera? You can find that out in my dedicated A6700 versus XS20 video comparison, which I link to at the end of the video and in the description. The A6700 is an all-round hybrid camera, meaning it hybrids between photography and film. Weighing only 493 grams, including card and battery, it could be a great companion for traveling, especially since it's weatherproof. The camera features an APS-C sensor with 1.5 times crop compared to a full-frame 35mm sensor. This means that when you use a full-frame 24mm lens, you're effectively at 36mm. And this could actually be very handy for sports and wildlife photography and film. Because the camera uses the E-mount, you can choose from many APS-C and full-frame lenses in a wide budget range. The rangefinder design makes the camera more compact, though if you use your left eye to look through the viewfinder, the screen will get condensed from your breath and your nose will be pressed up the screen. Last time I used the camera, it really felt like the shape of my nose changed, and I actually only noticed when I was recording a video of myself.
Yeah, my name is
So I guess I'll be just using my right eye from now on. The button layout feels natural and will be familiar to Sony users. A new dial has been added under the main mode dial, allowing you to switch between photo, video and slow and quick modes. Such a dial is quite handy as it speeds up the workflow. It is good to know that the menu also has separate settings and menus for video and S&Q. This may be confusing for new Sony users, but I'll get back to what S&Q does later in the video. There are 3 customizable FN buttons, which are important for creating a smooth workflow. They are fully customizable. The good thing is that every other button on the camera is customizable as well. And personally, I don't like that I have to press the ISO button before I can change it, so I change it to the big scroll wheel on the back. The SD card slot and microphone, headphone, USB-C and micro HDMI inputs are all located on the left side of the body. The upside of this is that you have a collection of cables all on one side of the body. The downside of this is that you have a collection of cables all on one side of the body. Luckily, the microphone input is placed at the top, so it won't cover too much of the screen. Sadly, you cannot send out higher film resolutions to an external recorder than you can record internally. Considering the size of the body, it is not strange the A6700 has just one card slot. It uses UHS-2 SD cards, and it's important to know you need an extra fast SD card in order to film 4K 120 FPS or to film 4K in higher bit rates. I'll get back to it later and link in the description. A vari-angle screen now is common on Sony cameras, but for many years Sony was the only brand still exclusively using flip screens. The advantage of a flip screen is that it can be tilted up a bit for the right angle without having to fully flip the screen open. The A6700 now features a 3-inch vari-angle screen with 1.03 million dots. It's not the highest resolution screen on the market, but it's more than sharp enough. The touchscreen also works well and is responsive. The viewfinder didn't improve much if we are looking at the A6600. It did get a fast refresh rate of 120 FPS. The camera has a sensor that automatically activates the viewfinder when you look through it, but this auto detect function seemed rather slow compared to other cameras. Battery life on the A6700 is quite disappointing. I've been using this camera alongside the Fujifilm X-S20, Sony A7 IV and Nikon Z8, and the 6700 always ran out of juice first. The FZ100 battery has a CPA rating of 550 shots with this camera, but in real life you get to about 1500 shots in RAW and JPEG, including shooting high-end 4K film. Even though you could last a good afternoon, good afternoon, and a single charge, I would recommend to buy an extra battery, and I definitely recommend to get an original one because they last longer. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Sony has introduced a completely revamped menu that is much better than the confusing one they had before. However, there are so many settings that it can be overwhelming for non-tech savvy users. Even if you want to dive into it, there's so much that I almost don't feel like it. On the other hand, you would have heard me complain if the A6700 had only basic settings. What I really don't like is the way you have to set your video resolution and quality. It is not instantly clear to me which one gives you the best quality, but I'll get back to video settings later in the film section of this review. Taking photos with the Sony A6700 can be done with 26 megapixels, and although this may seem limited, it is more than enough for most types of photography. The photos from the A6700 are sharp, have somewhat harder contrast, but have natural colors and saturation. And of course, you can adjust this to your liking later, especially if you use RAW files. Sony is known for producing accurate skin tones, and the A6700 is no exception. The automatic white balance also handles whites very well in various light situations. With a maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second and a conservative 11 photo per second burst, it is clear that you're not getting a sports or wildlife camera. Of course, you could still shoot any fast-moving subject, but it's not enough for serious and professional work. In all honesty, 1/8000th of a second is fast enough for most fast-moving subjects, even for creating dead still shots of, for example, hummingbirds. Sony cameras are also known for their good ISO values and noise reduction, but that mainly applies for their full-frame sensors. That means that APS-C sensors perform slightly less in this regard. You can confidently set the ISO up to 6400, but beyond that the noise becomes almost too heavy to work with. It is advisable to shoot in RAW when you find yourself in less well-lit situations, so it will be easier to remove noise in post-production. Autofocus has been becoming very important on cameras, but there will be photographers that say that only manual focus is real. But why? There's also a Gibson guitar that tunes the guitar automatically, but it doesn't mean you can play a Slash solo. In the current era of AI autofocus, there's so much possible and it can prevent expensive human errors. So what about the autofocus on the A6700? It incorporates the latest AI techniques thanks to the Beyond XR processor and AI chip. It can recognize many types of subjects and the focus uses 759 AF points placed across 100% of the sensor. A new subject being recognized are insects. These are added to the list of humans, animals, birds, flowers, vehicles, airplanes, drones, trains, and more. A downside is that you have to select the subjects manually in the menu, and at this moment only Nikon subject detection will switch automatically between subjects. I tried this insect focus and I wasn't too impressed. My little front yard has many flowers and it's the perfect place to snap some photos of bees. I used the Sony A6700 f4G OSS macro lens. It is good to know I used a f4 aperture, which challenges the camera. In macro photography, it's a good idea to use smaller apertures like f8 or f11, especially with faster insects. And honestly, a moving flower, fast-moving insects, and changing light conditions are always a challenge for a camera. So the autofocus does pick up on insects, but mostly when they're not moving too much. Birds and animals, on the other hand, are recognized and tracked very well. I took the camera to the zoo and it did an impressive job picking up the eyes of giraffes, iguanas, pelicans. Fun fact, my first ever job was at that same zoo as a beginning photographer, and I was so good they fired me after 2 weeks. Well, that's what I tell myself at least. If animals are partially hidden or camouflaged, the autofocus may have a harder time to recognize them, but that's also the idea of camouflage. Except for this crocodile, that one was easy, since it didn't move. Just like with other brands, human focus is the best. Sony, however, has an edge since they were the first to introduce eye focus in a camera. No matter how fast a person moves, focus in both photo and video is almost always perfect. Even during burst photography and AF tracking, the camera has little trouble keeping the eye in focus. You can move the focus point by tapping on the screen, provided you have this option enabled. Moving the AF point can also be done with the large button at the back by clicking left, right, and up and down, but that's quite slow and a joystick would have been handy. The best thing about the A6700 autofocus is that it all works in video as well. Automatic focus and tracking is even possible in 4K 120 FPS. All in all, I'm very happy with the photography features on this camera, and it is a big reason why this is one of the best advanced but compact travel cameras on the market. By the way, if you like what I'm doing, then give this video a like, or even better, subscribe to my channel so I can keep making more camera reviews. I want to get into the menu and its settings. These are sometimes a bit messy, especially understanding which XAVC setting is best. To make it easy for you, here are the settings, bit and frame rates in one screen with an overview which image quality is best. For shooting video in the highest quality, you can set the A6700 to UHD 4K 60 FPS, 422 10-bit and 600 Mbps. This will require V90 SD cards, which are fast but expensive. Using a 128 GB card with these settings will get you about 30 minutes of 4K 60 FPS footage. Fortunately, even with 420 and 8-bit, you get sharp footage from the camera in all resolutions. And you don't need the fastest cards for that. When you film in 4K up to 30 FPS, the film is taken from the 6K sensor, which means you get a 6K resolution downsized to 4K, and that means extra sharp footage. If you want to record 4K 120 FPS slow motion, you need cards of the V60 class. If you don't have or don't want to buy V90 cards, you could get away with just using V60 cards, since you can film every resolution and frame rate in lower bit rates, aka lower quality. It's good to know that an additional crop, zoom in, is applied to your image when you film in 4K 120 FPS. Personally, I don't mind, since 120 FPS is amazing with animals and birds, and getting close is important. There's another option you can choose, which is S&Q mode. Here you can choose your record frame rate and the output frame rate. For example, if you record at 24 FPS with an output of 120 FPS, you will have a slow motion of 5 times. It is also possible to create a quick motion, for example a time-lapse, by setting the record FPS at 24 and the output at 2 FPS, and that will give you a 12 times quick motion video. Which one should you use for slow motion? S&Q or normal movie slow motion? Simply said, if you need the audio with your slow motion, like I did at the beginning of the video, you should use the normal movie slow motion. This means you will get a 120 FPS file, which you need to slow down yourself. If you want the footage slowed down for you, choose the S&Q setting. This will save you quite some time in post-production, since you don't have to make space on your timeline and slow down every file. And it's also important to know that S&Q does not record audio, and everything you do is irreversible. Now, grading the footage is something else. I have a certain style, which is quite easy to reach when you use normal color profiles. But it gets more difficult when you start using the flat image profile S-Log3. S-Log3 is designed to capture maximum information in highlights and shadows, and that is why you get such a flat image out of camera. S-Cinetone is a newer picture profile which should give you cinematic images and, according to Sony, doesn't need any color correction. I would still grade it though. You could compare it to the Eterna Cinema film simulation on Fujifilm cameras, which is different than log. With S-Log3, you get the most light information out of the sensor, where you have to sacrifice some information when you use S-Cinetone. If you have the time, it is great to use S-Log3, but if you need a cinematic look and don't have too much time, it is better to use S-Cinetone.
Make sure to hit that subscribe button, else you might be auto-framed.
Oh, that doesn't make sense at all. Auto-framing. The idea is that the camera automatically creates a smaller and moving crop. This makes a static image more dynamic. Auto-framing works in 3 modes: wide, medium, and close. In the close mode, the camera will zoom in more and creates a portrait. Meanwhile, you can see shots of me making a fool out of myself while testing the auto-framing. You can adjust the auto-framing speed from 1 to 5, and this affects the tracking speed. After testing for a while, I think the best setting at tracking speed is 3 or 2. Above that, it just gets too hectic, and especially when you're zoomed in, but it also depends on your style. The safest option is always to use a wide shot, like 16 or 24 millimeters, together with a good close-up. Keep in mind not to stand further than 5 to 7 meters away from the camera, otherwise the cropping stops. You always zoom in on 4K material, which means this only works well if you're uploading your video in Full HD. It's actually kind of cool you have a second camera person with you without post-processing. It is useful if you want to create a slightly more dynamic shot without the need of using key points in post-production. And if you would practice a bit, I think this could be a feature that's used a lot by vloggers working on their own. Also, keep in mind you have no control over the video zoom because it's already done in the camera. Often, zooming in at the right moment can emphasize certain words you say or something happening in the frame. Most importantly, the zoom-ins and crops are permanent, so use the function wisely. As with all cameras that offer high bit and frame rates, they might overheat, and the same counts for the Sony A6700. I did another test where I made it extra warm around the A6700 and Fujifilm X-S20. After more than an hour of recording in 4K 4:2 10-bit, both cameras were still recording. They felt warm, but probably could have gone way longer. This is interesting because when I was filming in summer, the A6700 would already overheat after 5 minutes. So I guess it really has to do with the temperature outside. But more interesting of this test is the battery. Where the X-S20 had more than half left, the A6700 just had 36% left, and it confirms that battery life on the A6700 is just very bad. The A6700 is not an easy camera and is definitely a more advanced and high-end APS-C model. When this camera was released in 2023, it cost about $1,700, but you can find it now for way less money. I think Sony chose to do this in order to be able to compete with cameras like the X-S20. It also really depends where in the world you are. Here, in the Netherlands, the A6700 is still €1,700, while the competition is way cheaper. Since the life of the battery is not great and V90 cards and lenses are costly, you need to have a good budget. And overall, it is a great purchase if you want a travel-sized, weatherproof APS-C hybrid camera. But if you're not sure yet, check out my Fujifilm X-S20 review or Sony A6700 versus X-S20 comparison to help you decide.